Welcome back, Wolfpack Verlis here, and if I have learned one truth in the world, it is this: that whenever there is a discussion going on about Smogon Bans, there will always be these comment interactions. That the first person will say, well, this Pokemon shouldn't really be banned, I use X Pokemon to beat this Pokemon all the time, and the rest of my team never gives me problems. Maybe I've lost to it once or twice, but it's never an overwhelming threat that makes me feel like it has to be removed from the game, or something similar to that. Mostly, I use this Pokemon, it beats that Pokemon, and I never have problems with it. And then there will be, without a doubt, someone coming in and saying, no, this Pokemon has no counters, and it is very hard to deal with, and here's a reason why your Pokemon is beaten by the Pokemon that we are saying needs to be banned, or that the Pokemon is already banned, and then they'll try to defend it in that way. So I did kind of blur up the names, but really all this is an interaction between Mega Lucario and Volcarona, and on the surface, seems pretty legit, that when we look at it, that the first person says, well, my Volcarona beats Lucario, and then the second person says, well, Lucario can carry Stone Edge, so Lucario wins. Now, naturally, that's kind of how a lot of these things break down. That someone's going to say, well, either the Pokemon switching in is always going to land a 2-hit KO. That's one of the main things behind a counter. That across all of its moveset, across all potential predictions, that there is no reasonable Pokemon that isn't 2 or 3-hit KO'd by it that can actually deal with that Pokemon, and that's the whole counter mentality. But what we really need to do is we need to go deeper, and here is why I feel that Smogon Bans are so very flawed. So on the surface, it seems like an impenetrable argument that Volcarona cannot beat a Mega Lucario. But I decided to do some digging, so I came in, I stepped into this comment thread, and I said, alright, so I went onto the Pokemon Global link, and I looked up the usage stats for Lucario and Mega Lucario. That the actual usage for Stone Edge on Mega Lucario is so low that it isn't even tracked. That it's less than 17%. That doesn't mean it's like 16 or 15 or 17%. It's actually so few that it's not even calculated, that it's not even tracked in the Pokemon Global link, so it's probably far less than 17%, maybe somewhere around 10 or even less than 10%. So that's going to be a problem right there. So for more accurate data, I even used Smogon's own database to find the usage statistics on Lucario, and only 9% of Lucario have a Stone Edge. So that means, in this situation, Volcarona wins against Lucario 91% of the time. And this is just kind of say, you know, Volcarona switches in, Lucario doesn't go for a prediction or anything fancy, it just uses Close Combat. Now, Close Combat or any of Lucario's moves are a 3-hit KO. So that means Volcarona can switch in, endure KO, and then send a Flamethrower Lucario's way and put it back in its Pokeball, because there is no way Lucario is going to survive that. So unless Stone Edge is going to be used against Volcarona, Volcarona will always win that battle. That's only a 9% chance that Lucario wins. Also, if we take into account the 80% accuracy of Stone Edge, it's more around 7 to 8% that this matchup is won. Now, does that mean Volcarona is a counter or not, or does that mean it's a reliable way of handling the Lucario? Just because Lucario can maybe sometimes, less than 10% of the time, deal with a Volcarona, is that enough to justify Lucario not having any counters? And it's the same with every Pokemon, that in these comment threads you're going to see a long list of damage calculations saying this 2-hit KOs, this 2-hit KOs, this 2-hit KOs, this 1-hit KOs. There is nothing that handles the Pokemon. But if we actually look at it realistically with usage statistics and just logic, all of it falls apart, and that's what I'm talking about. The problem here is also how arbitrary the definition of counter is. That since it is an unofficial term, since it is kind of managed by the community, it's kind of what you want it to be. Is a counter that under every worst situation this Pokemon will always be able to handle the Pokemon, or is it just under very favorable circumstances? I would consider a 93% chance for Volcarona to beat a Lucario very favorable, that I would consider that a counter, even though it's not 100%, it's not always going to do it, but realistically you can say, yeah, Volcarona is going to beat up on the Lucario, and that's before we even get into very fancy technical stuff. So you can make for that what you want, but I feel that that is indeed a problem. Another problem that I feel is going on with all of this is just when people say, well, this Pokemon can't switch into it. It doesn't matter if it's faster, like say Volcarona is Scarfed. So realistically, Volcarona switches in, it eats whatever Lucario is using, and then throws out a Flamethrower faster than Lucario, and then it automatically wins. Now, the idea behind that is, well, Lucario is just going to predict Volcarona coming in, it's going to use Stone Edge, and then Volcarona dies before it has a chance to win. So therefore, that's the worst case scenario, and that means Volcarona has 0 chance of countering Lucario, even as a Scarf, even if it is getting the outspeeds, because it's just going to get one shot on that perfect prediction. And that's kind of why these bans have so much logic behind them, that a lot of sweeper Pokemon they are frail. If they do get predicted against, they are most likely to get one shot, even though they could be a two-shot Pokemon. So that is one of the problems that we do see from time to time. Now let's also go and look at why 2-hit KO counters are not even realistic anyways. So we need to look at this from a neutral battle scenario. Now what has to happen here is that two Pokemon are on the field, and let's just say I'm on the right. My Pokemon KOs his Pokemon. That's not unfair, that's not unbalanced, that is what has to happen, because then he brings in his Pokemon that's banned. Let's say it's Blaziken, let's say it's Mega Lucario, let's say it's Greninja. This can be any Pokemon where an argument that this Pokemon cannot be countered comes into play. So that means, like, if we just play out the battle, he's using this Pokemon because it is stronger than my Pokemon, so he goes and KOs me, and then I bring my counter to his Pokemon, which is also a check. That here's where the counter argument falls apart. That generally when someone says this Pokemon has no counters, the Pokemon also has a lot of checks. Blaziken, it's checked by Focus Sash, it's checked by fast Pokemon, it's checked by bulky Pokemon. Talonflame is always going to check it, and it also is a counter. Same with Greninja. If you have a Scarf Pokemon, you just outspeed Greninja and one-shot it because it's frail. So that's kind of the idea here, is that I knock out his Pokemon, he knocks out mine, I bring in something that theoretically knocks out his banned Pokemon. But the reason why this Pokemon is banned by this ban logic is because, we'll say I'm just going to go and switch straight into my counter. I'm not going to lose my Pokemon to freeze, so I'm just going to go into Talonflame, endure the hit, and then just throw a Brave Bird into Blaziken's face, and now I countered his Pokemon. Well, what the logic is, well, Blaziken can learn Stone Edge. Lucario can learn Stone Edge. Whatever Pokemon I'm trying to counter can learn the move that's going to stop the Pokemon I'm switching in. So I switch in Talonflame, they get the perfect prediction, completely understanding that I'm going into Talonflame, and then they go for the KO, which means, okay, now I lose my Talonflame, which means the banned Pokemon has no theoretical counters, GG, game over, Pokemon's too strong. Now here's the problem with that. It requires perfect predictive play. That if he went for a Stone Edge, say, against my Excadrill, that my Excadrill scores a KO on his first Pokemon, he brings in Blaziken. Naturally, Excadrill isn't going to want to deal with that. Blaziken can protect, it can outspeed me, it can do a lot of really scary things. Let's say he's certain that my Excadrill isn't Scarf, there's no Sand Force, it's just my Pokemon versus his. Blaziken has the advantage. It can do whatever it wants. It can hit me with a high jump kick, Excadrill is going to faint, it can Blaze Kick me, it can do whatever, and my Excadrill is going to go down. But at the same time, my Excadrill still has the chance of knocking out Blaziken with an Earthquake. That I use that, Blaziken goes down. So the thought is that in my preservation of Excadrill, I'm switching into Talonflame. Talonflame is going to endure that high jump kick. Talonflame is going to go and endure the Blaze Kick. It's going to endure whatever, so I'm going to Talonflame and then I scare it off with a Brave Bird or I just knock it out. So my opponent anticipates this, throws out the Stone Edge, but at the same time, say if he uses Stone Edge against my Excadrill. Now Excadrill, who is already +1, which means even if I lose Excadrill by, say, keeping it in against Blaziken using Blaze Kick or whatever, it's still going to be a neutral battle situation where we're going to be even. So the idea here is, like, say I keep an Excadrill, he goes for the Stone Edge. He misses his prediction, and now it's just as likely that instead of KOing Talonflame, I KO his banned Pokemon because he overpredicted. And that's why I feel that it's random, that no matter what you can do, that no matter how you splice it, it's going to come down to a perfect prediction that can almost cost the Pokemon if it misses the prediction. I don't think that that's solid enough reasoning for a ban to matter. Also, we can look at it like this. In the event that, say, I switch out my Pokemon and Blaziken does get the perfect prediction, Blaziken should be rewarded for that prediction. That was a very, very risky situation for Talonflame to come in and then also be able to get countered out immediately by a good prediction. That's more of the player's guess being better than the opponent's guess. Blaziken, Greninja, Mega Lucario, Landorus, all these Pokemon, they are rewarded for that predictive play, but that's their strength. That's what makes them excel as a Pokemon, because they have a lot of weaknesses outside of it. They miss the prediction, they don't carry the right move at the right time, and then they kind of fall flat, and that's where a big problem comes in for these Pokemon. So I don't know why the opponent being better really makes it to where that Pokemon is worthy of being banned. With that logic, you can kind of make it that almost any Pokemon that's a sweeper can be banned, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a bit. Alright, but what if we switch around the scenario? Say that Blaziken switches out. Blaziken doesn't want to get KO'd by Talonflame, so now I have the same opportunity that Blaziken just had. That I can do the different move expecting the opponent's Pokemon to come in, or I can switch out, and then that's when you see a lot of double switches and triple switches in battles. That I'm going, alright, Talonflame's on the field. He's not going to give up his Blaziken for free, so he's switching into a Pokemon that stops Talonflame, then I have to think about his team, then I think about my team, and I switch into a Pokemon that stops potentially his Pokemon, and now we're just countering each other's counters to counter counters, and that's not reliable logic. I don't understand how someone can take that seriously, because this situation is just as easily reversed. and then we eventually get into some kind of roundabout to where now I'm in a position to where, okay, what about my Pokemon? Am I going to predict his Blaziken coming in? So say my Excadrill's back on the field, he wants to bring Blaziken back in, he wants to resist an Iron Head, he anticipates the Rock Slide, then he wants to knock out through some kind of retaliation. I could just as easily say, okay, Earthquake. Now I knock out his Blaziken before it comes back in and wreaks havoc, and that's just kind of it. That even if there's a counter on the field, even if there's a non-counter, you just try to get into some kind of weird position, and that means that there shouldn't be any logic behind it. That it's such a roundabout way of thinking, and that's why I just call it the prediction circle jerk. That whenever you use this to ban a Pokemon or decide a Pokemon's strengths, it's not reason, it's not fact. There is no logic behind this that actually determines the Pokemon's strength. That Pokemon isn't played in a vacuum. I think that that's one of the biggest things I can ever say about anything in Pokemon. It's not playing in a vacuum. There's 6 different Pokemon on each team. There's so many different things that can happen in a battle that you just can't say, alright, this Pokemon does this, and in theory it does this, and then it wins. But when you actually get to the reality of the battle, it's not like that at all, and it's not factual in any way. So that's why I did this video, for the most part up to this point. That if someone says, well, X should be banned because it has no counters, just tell them this. Like, it just shows that there's, like, you can have a scenario where that Pokemon does nothing. And that's why I feel, this is how I feel about bans. Give me a Pokemon that is guaranteed to knock out 2 Pokemon before it goes down. That every time it hits the field, it goes 2 for 1. If you can give me a Pokemon that does that, then I will say it'll be banned. That is an unbalanced Pokemon. That Pokemon does not deserve to be played because there's no counterplay to that. With all these Pokemon, there's still counterplay. Not necessarily direct damage counters, but you can still play around this Pokemon. The way I play Pokemon is different from the way you play Pokemon. The way I think about the game is going to be different to how you think about the Pokemon can be handled. I might find a way around it that you didn't, and that's the thing. You hear all these people saying, Greninja doesn't give me problems. You know, I might lose 1, sometimes 2 Pokemon to it, but I've had silly Pokemon beat me as well. I'm not going to like randomly throw one off the top of my head, but you know, some random Pokemon can come in, just stomp out your team, get 2 or 3 KOs, and it was more effective than their banned Pokemon that they were using on their team. That if you're ready for the Aegislash, you're ready for the Blaziken, you're ready for whatever, sometimes it just goes 0. That it doesn't even have an impact in the game. That doesn't sound like a Pokemon that can be banned if it has that failure state, even when being played optimally by a skilled player. It can just fall flat, and that's one of the big things here. I think Greninja is probably one of the also just biggest Pokemon that is really nonsensical with this logic, because for that, Greninja has to be some kind of weird mixed Pokemon that's running the absolute perfect EV and moveset spread while making the predictions with potentially like 8 or 9 moves. That if you look at the bottom, that's a Greninja that doesn't know Ice Beam or Scald to try to counter out all these counters. So in theory, if Greninja could learn 10 moves, have 252 EVs in attack, speed, and special attack while also carrying a nature that has no drawbacks whatsoever, sure, then it counters out everything. But in reality, that doesn't happen in a Pokemon battle, and it does get checked into oblivion like we mentioned earlier, which is why you'll see people time and time again talking about Greninja, talking about Blaziken, talking about Lucario. I say Lucario doesn't give me problems. It might have won a battle against me, or I might have actually like stumbled against it, but it's never been a Pokemon that every time I see it I go, oh man, I lose, because more often than not, I've beaten it. I beat Greninja. I beat all these Pokemon that are faced against me, and for some reason that makes me a bad player to some people, and there's other people that agree. Other people have had this, and that's where we're going against theoretical versus anecdotal. Well, I just showed why in theory it doesn't work. Pokemon's not playing in a vacuum, and talking about counters, there's no logic behind that. It's counter logic to talk about counter logic. There's no factual things about it, and that's all you can do. If someone says, well, this Pokemon has 2 KOs against everything, so it should be banned, just tell them that it's such a roundabout circle jerk of prediction. Nothing about it can be used as anything realistic. And now let's get to the next part of the video. Now that first part was just talking about why predictions don't really work for talking about counters and stuff. Now let's also talk about why predictions aren't reliable. So in my recent video, a lot of people have taken it upon themselves to take whatever I've said out of context to some kind of absurd level. I never said that there is no prediction, or there is no skill in a prediction. But I said against evenly matched opponents with very similar teams, which is what we saw in VGC, there's really a hard way of defining skill in that. That one player is just as likely to do something against the other player. Say if we're evenly matched on skill, there's no read I can get. There's no advantage I have that either knowledge-wise, predictive-wise, or team-wise that really works out. That there were so many similar Pokemon, so many similar teams in the top 8 for VGC, it was stagnant, and you really can't make much of an argument for skill. Tell me how someone with even teams, even like 1 or 2 different Pokemon, is actually 1 or 2 different Pokemon makes it even more random, because do they bring the one counter that they brought against their team, or are they bringing the one counter against your team? That just makes it more of a mind game where you have to guess. And when we think about it at its most basic form, prediction is a synonym for guess. That sure, you can have an educated guess, but you can never have a guess that's absolutely certain. By definition, there isn't a certain guess. That's why there's educated guesses. So no matter how much skill you have, even if you have all the skill, the maximum skill possible in the game, you never know what your opponent's going to do. You can't read minds. Your opponent can do something absolutely stupid that ends up making them win the game because you overpredict. This is my experience and why I think there's actually more luck inside of predictions than skill, but skill does still play that factor, that if you understand what predictions are about, like, you know, if you have that base fundamental understanding of predictions, you can adapt some kind of predictive skill about that. But then there's other skills you still need to master, team building skill, other strategic skill, and then you just kind of have to hope that your opponent, you know, does the right thing that you anticipate. That's all anticipation, it's all guessing, and that's not skill in any way, that just boils down to luck. So let's say we're in game 3 of like the finals. We're at the 2 highest potential skilled Pokemon players in the game. Let's just say for the fun of it, you and me, and we're running fairly similar teams. I have a counter pick to your team, but you also have a counter pick to my team, and it's just one of those things. In the first round, you beat me because you opened with the right Pokemon. I played around that, and on the second round, I beat you. So in the third round, what happens? It's just going to be pure randomness because I've done something that proves I can beat your team, you've done something that proves you can beat my team, and now it's just a mind game. Am I going to play the same thing I played last game, or are you going to anticipate I played the same thing I played last game, and then you build your entire strategy around that? It's random. Am I going to anticipate that, and then I go, okay, he's going to do what he did the first game, so I'm going to stop that by playing something else that I didn't do in both games. It's just going to be random. That's the thing about human nature. It's completely random, and I have a lot of experience with this on Pokemon Showdown, that I just go for the ballsy plays, and it's like a 50-50 if it works or not. And that's why I call VGC a mentality issue, that there's an over-reliance on predictions right now, because everyone thinks that it's the best thing ever. Sure, it helps you secure games, but when you get into even matchups, or when you get into a place where you overpredict, it can cost you games just as statistically as it can win you games. That against Azumarill, like I Mega Evolve my Sableye, I'll throw out a Will-O-Wisp against Azumarill, just because half the time, stuff happens. You know, I use Will-O-Wisp, the Azumarill either switches out because they think, oh, I have Azumarill against Sableye. There's no way he's an idiot and keeping Sableye in, so that means I'm switching out Azumarill. He's going to switch in something that stops my Azumarill. I need to switch Azumarill into a Pokemon that stops his stop to my Azumarill. They'll do that, so that's a free Will-O-Wisp on the Pokemon because I didn't switch. I held my ground and now I have the advantage. Or it goes the other way around, you know, it could be Belly Drum. You don't know the set on your opponent until you've actually encountered it in battle, so I throw out the Will-O-Wisp and then he goes for Belly Drum. Now he only has 2 times his attack instead of 4 times the attack. He's missing a lot of health, he's burned taking damage, and then I can go into my counter to Azumarill, and if he switches out, well, he lost his turn and all that health for free. Or at the same time, you know, I throw out Will-O-Wisp, he gets burned, he still destroys me from the play rough. It can go all over the place. He could try to throw out a Waterfall for that predictive play instead of just going for the direct KO. That just happens everywhere. That one of the things that happened, one of the most common, is when I was running Mega Medicham, people lead Ferrothorn, I just use High Jump Kick on the first turn and I KO them, and they say, but I had a chance to protect. Well, I had a chance that I just threw out that and you don't protect. Because if they anticipate that I'm thinking they're protecting, then they don't protect and they get the advantage. So that's where all of this stupid play comes from, that you can never be sure of what your opponent's thinking. There's always luck factor. There's always luck factor, and because even in the most even match situation, in a scenario where you don't have skill to rely on over your opponent, then what can you do? And that's why we saw such a stagnation in teams, that no one was going for those other aspects of skill in the game. No one was diversifying with the strategic skill. No one was diversifying with the skill with team building. Now sure, there were better teams throughout the top 32. I will say that. I'm saying with what we saw in the top 8 and just how it is in general. Once you get to a certain point, you see most of the same teams over and over, and then some counter teams to those teams. And it's just some kind of mess right now, and people are taking it out of context, and that's a big problem. I feel I'm fairly correct in everything I've said, that there's no way to have more predictive skill over an evenly matched opponent, and when you're talking about counters and stuff, it's just the same scenario over and over. You're as likely to make a prediction as I am to predict you. So why does that make a Pokemon stronger than the other? It's like, okay, it gets a 2-hit KO. Well, maybe in theory, but if I play this and then do this and then do something else, now you lose enough advantage to where that 2-hit KO doesn't matter. I'm going to find a way around that Pokemon but then at the same time they're just as likely. So it's not about the Pokemon, it's about the player matchups, which is why the elitist at Smogon, it's only the top people that make the decision. So really, if they want a Pokemon Gun, they can kind of rig it however they want. Earlier, as we saw, it sounds like Volcarona can never beat a Lucario because Lucario might have that chance of carrying Stone Edge or Rock Slide. But in reality, once we factor in the numbers, once we factor in the prediction, no, it's not going to have the perfect moveset every time. If it's carrying Stone Edge or Rock Slide, then there's a Pokemon that isn't Volcarona that still counters that Pokemon, and you might encounter it in battle. It's not an uncounterable Pokemon. And that's just kind of how this entire thing breaks down. Same with Salamence. I didn't even mention Mega Salamence, an uncounterable Pokemon as well. It's just one of those things. You'll find counters. There is always going to be luck in the game. I think that the problem is all these high-level players, they're cocky, they're arrogant, they think that they're better than everyone else. So they say, oh, of course it's skill. I outplayed you, so it's going to be my skill being better than yours. No luck involved whatsoever, even though you can never anticipate where your opponent's going to do 100% of the time. You're still making that guess. They might just have that edge against you. But they could maybe be a lesser opponent, that they don't have as much game knowledge or experience, but they just make a different play than what you anticipate, and now you lose to a lesser skilled player because there is that element of luck, that you never have enough skill to overwhelm that element of luck, and that's pretty much the main thing behind this. I think I've said everything I need to. So there will be people that take even this video out of context, but that's when you can just look at them and see their ignorance and shake your head, because there's really not many ways of getting around these arguments, because that's just how Pokemon works. It's not the set-in-stone vacuum that people make it out to be by being with this terrible mentality of poor sportsmanship and toxicity over being better than everyone else, and this over-reliance on prediction. That if anything, we're in just an over-predictive meta right now, and that can change. All we need is some free thinkers. All we need are people to change their minds about how the game is played, and then the meta shifts. We can go back to that skillful reliance that we saw in 2014. 2013 was like a predictive year again, but I mean back before we had all this reliance, back before there was a heavy concentration of people trying to maintain this meta, we had a lot more freedom, we had a lot more fun in Pokemon, and that's all I've ever been fighting for. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you all have a nice day. Thank you for watching.